It's becoming more and more common for companies to get rid of their QA teams. So that has me asking the question, do we still need dedicated testers in 2023? Hi, I'm Chris Harbert, founder and CEO of Testery. Testery helps companies orchestrate their test runs to get faster, greener, more cost effective test runs. Before we jump in, let's look at why some companies might want to get rid of their QA teams. I think it's a few things. First and foremost, there's a lack of respect for the complexity of testing. If you think about it, finding all of the bugs and all of the possible paths of an application is one of the intractable problems in computer science. So, really identifying which bugs are important and finding them quickly and efficiently requires a certain amount of skill, art, and tools all coming together in a nice way to get the job done. This is actually a really complex problem. Additionally, I think a lot of companies had the wrong expectations for the people they hired. So there are very different types of testers in test automation. There are people who do manual testing. There are people who copy and paste scripts. There are people who use record and playback tools. And there are people who know how to write code just as well as any other developer. And if you hire one of these roles and then put them in the wrong position in your company, you're not going to get the best results. So hiring a manual tester and saying, okay, I want you to go learn how to write software code and automated tests that are clean code and well written is often going to be a challenge. Now, are there some people who make that leap and go from being excellent manual testers to being excellent software developer style testers? Absolutely. But it's a big challenge. And so if you've hired one team and are expecting them to do something else, that could be a real challenge for you. There are also the dynamics of having highly specialized functional teams. So, specialization versus generalization is a common theme in technology teams. Specialized teams means people know their particular function really well. So maybe they're a UI developer and they know UI frameworks really well. Maybe they're an API developer and they know API frameworks really well. And that's a form of specialization. Generalization means you kind of know a little bit of everything. Well, anytime we have too many teams that are too specialized, you end up with challenges when it comes to scheduling work. Which team's queue do I put this work in? How do those teams interact with each other? And so collaboration and communication are more difficult in teams that are highly specialized. And I think that's one of the reasons, probably one of the main reasons, that people shy away from having dedicated QA teams. Another interesting dynamic is that when testing is considered part of development and it shows up on the balance sheet, it often looks like research and development. So organizationally, executives are saying, okay, this is the cost of investing in our technology and building software. When you start breaking out into a separate line item, what are you spending on QA? It becomes way too easy for people to view this as an expense that just needs to be managed versus thinking about all of the great things that good solid QA and test automation do to accelerate shipping good clean code full of features that actually work to production. And I think because of this, companies want to say, how can we manage our expenses? Maybe we're trying to be profitable this year when historically we haven't been profitable. Is this an area that we can cut? And I think that's a big threat to QA. I think it's often very short-sighted approach from management. But when you separate out how much are we spending on development versus how much are we spending on QA and testing, that can be an easy leap for them to make. And then the other thing I think that's an issue here is that management often only sees the bugs that you don't catch. So in test automation and QA, we do a lot of work to test every version of every build. We might be running thousands of tests multiple times per day. Developers are finding and fixing those issues, but if we don't find and fix every single issue, the issues that make it to production are the ones that get noticed. They get the most attention, and then it draws questions of, well, how much are we spending on this and what kind of results are we actually getting? And so a lot of times we're measuring the failure to deliver results, but we're not properly measuring the success in how much results we're actually delivering. And a lot of the benefit of doing QA and test automation is things that are harder to measure. And so I think that's part of the issue. So, what happens if you do get rid of your QA team? Well, believe it or not, there actually are some positive things that happen. So, one, it's easier to schedule work. So, when you have separate specialized teams, if you have a development team and a QA team, you might be scheduling work for the dev team, and then whenever it's dev complete, it goes over to the QA team. And so now you've got two separate queues. Maybe they're working out of what we call staggered sprints, where it's a developer sprint and a QA sprint. And if you switch to cross-functional teams without specialists, you just put all of the work into one queue, and then people get it done when they get it done. And so getting rid of your QA team can mean that you're going to have more predictable work going through your queues. You also end up with a situation where developers are more accountable. So it's kind of like a performer in the circus who does or doesn't have a safety net. If you don't have a safety net, then you're going to definitely make sure you know how to walk that tightrope. And the same dynamic exists with development and QA. If you're a developer and you have a QA team, it's way too easy to say, oh, I'm just going to update the code. I'm not going to check it out locally. I'll put it out there. And somebody on the QA team, it'll be their job to fix it. And it's that whole it's not my job mentality that can be really harmful to a company's QA culture. And so if you don't have that safety net at all, then that encourages your team to have better performance. Is that reckless? It can be, right? So you need to be very careful there if that's what you think you're getting by getting rid of your QA team. Another advantage is that development requires people who know how to code, and test automation these days also requires people who know how to code. So there are tools out there for, record and playback, or things where AI is helping you do a certain part of it. But the bottom line is, in 2023 today, if you want to have good, effective, easy to maintain, fast, reliable test automation, it almost certainly requires a certain amount of software development and some skills in understanding how to write clean, maintainable code. And so if you already have developers in-house who know how to do that, it's awfully tempting to say, okay, I want you to do feature work, but I also want you to do all of these kinds of tests. This also helps keep the code and the tests in sync with each other. So one of the biggest things that we see that results in tests that might be considered flaky is if the version of the test doesn't actually line up with the version of the code being tested. And so if you only have one team that's doing both the testing and the development, then it's easy to get those versions to line up. If they're on separate teams working out of separate repositories, you can still do it, but it's more of a challenge. Another advantage of only having a developer team and not a specialized QA team is that less communication across teams has to take place. And you say, well, why do you want less communication to take place? Well, obviously communication is a good thing, but anytime we increase the complexity of communication, we make it less likely that communication is going to happen when it needs to. We make it more likely that issues are going to come up because people didn't understand each other. Maybe the requirements were stated in one meeting and they were laying out the test plan in another meeting on a separate team, and there was a crossover in communication and they didn't quite get the requirements right in that. So by only having one software delivery team, you kind of eliminate that need for cross-team communication. And that can actually be a good thing. Okay, so that's a lot of advantages and it sounds pretty great, but what could possibly go wrong if you just get rid of your dedicated testers? Well, when I got started early in my career, I worked for an extreme programming shop. We had roughly 60 developers without dedicated testers. And so developers were responsible for writing code, and we're also responsible for writing tests. In fact, we did a really good job of test-driven development. One developer would write a test, the developer sitting next to them would write the code for the test. Not a single line of code went to production without first having an automated test. And really, that's what people today are looking at as this is a best practice that we really want to strive for, is let's have automated tests, let's rely on them, let's ship multiple times per day, and let's make sure that everything is being tested. But one thing that I saw happen when we did that was that no one owned the problem of how do we get the test to be fast? How do we get the test to be reliable? And what does our overall approach to testing and quality look like? Are we bringing in any vendors or tools to help us out with any of that? It was essentially a situation where because it was everyone's problem, it was no one's problem. And I think that's the biggest risk in moving away from having dedicated testers or having a separate QA team is you can end up with a situation where because it's everyone's problem, it's no one's problem. Another issue with getting rid of dedicated testers is that teams full of generalists lack specialized knowledge. So that means they can take care of 80 or 90% of the user stories that come through their queue just fine. But whenever they come into situations where specialized knowledge is useful, maybe it's a particular type of defect that someone who's been in the QA space for a long time is going to know really well. I'm thinking anything related to time zones. People who've been software testers for a long time know that things like counting the number of events that happened in a day can actually be a different count depending on what time zone you're in, because the day isn't the same depending on what time zone you're in, which sometimes takes folks, who are a couple years out of school a while to realize when they're junior developers. And so there are different issues like that where having specialized knowledge can help. Getting test frameworks to run reliably requires you to know, what's the difference between an element not clickable at point exception, or what's the difference between, WebDriver wait and thread.sleep. Why would you want to use one versus the other? And so as we get a certain amount of specialized knowledge, that means that we can solve certain problems faster and get better results sooner. So I've seen a lot of cases where, junior developers who these days aren't inexpensive hires either might spin their wheels for a few days on a problem where if you brought in a specialist, they could be able to solve that problem in 30 minutes. And it's no knock to the developers. It's just that experience actually does matter. Another issue with getting rid of dedicated testers is diffusion of responsibility. So, we've all seen situations where there's someone on the side of the road who needs help and everyone is driving by and no one's stopping. And everyone just kind of assumes, well, somebody else has already done it or somebody else is going to call it in. And then you find out that no one's actually called for help, no one's stopping to help. And the reason why is because when we're in crowds, we just naturally think, somebody's going to take care of it. I don't really need to step in. And that's a huge issue when you get rid of dedicated testers or get rid of your QA team, is now you have a situation where, everybody knows testing is important. Everybody knows we should do it, but nobody's willing to stop working on features to really focus on learning the problem well to get to a good result for the company. And this can lead to huge inefficiencies in how tests are run and how reliable the test results are. And finally, another reason why it's risky to get rid of your dedicated testers is that good developers and good testers often have different personalities. So more and more, the skills required to be a good developer and the skills required to be a good tester are coming together. You have to know how to write code. You have to know how to make it clean, easy to maintain. You have to know object-oriented design principles. These things are becoming more and more common for both developers and testers. But people who tend to make good developers are often people who enjoy wowing the customer. They like to build something really cool and flashy really quick so that they can put it in the hands of a customer who can say, wow, this is amazing. It really solves my problem well. The challenge there is that makes it way too easy to overlook all of the different things that could possibly go wrong with what they just built, because as they're addressing each of those branches, they're not actually adding something that the customer is going to see anytime soon. And so they're not really getting that wow that their personality is kind of aligned with trying to get them towards. Great testers, on the other hand, are often folks who like to take things apart and put them back together. They might like solving puzzles. And they spend a lot of time thinking about, okay, what are all of the things that could possibly break here? How is the system built, and is there anything about the way that the system was built that I can exploit to try to find something that doesn't work properly? And because of that personality mindset, they're drawn to doing the work in a different way. And so I think a huge mistake teams make whenever they either get rid of their QA team or they try to move from having specialized teams to cross-functional teams is they don't take into account that you want to have a team with a good balance of those different types of personalities. You want to have some people on the team who really like building things that look cool, that solve problems for customers, and really get the customers to say, wow, that makes my life so much easier. And you also want to have people on the team who like thinking about how things work and how they're put together and what can possibly break when those things get put together in the way that they were put together. And so as a result, having a good, healthy mix on your team of people with those different personalities is a huge win. And one of the easiest ways to do that is by hiring people who specialize in development and hiring people who specialize in test automation. And then you're likely to naturally get a bit of a balance between those different personalities. I think that's pretty critical in how you design your team, regardless of what organizational structure you choose to use. So we have these different approaches. What's the solution here? I think a hybrid approach for most organizations is a good option. We need to have dedicated testers shifting from a role that's more about assurance to a role that's more about enablement. So, what does that mean? That means instead of just writing the tests and instead of just picking up a build, writing tests for it, running the tests, reporting bugs, that means working closely with people who are specialized in development to make sure that they are properly testing their code. So that means participating when it's planning and we're writing out acceptance criteria for user stories to make sure that those acceptance criteria include different edge cases that people on the product team might not necessarily be thinking about. It means getting involved in actually fixing bugs. So instead of just reporting bugs, we can be more helpful members of our team if we go in and we actually fix them. And it means coaching and providing examples to developers. So an experienced, dedicated tester on the team is like gold that's going to help people who are more junior developers learn what are all of the different types of bugs that happen. How do we decompose user stories into a way so that they're more testable? How do we write good, clean code that can be tested? And how do we make sure that all of the systems we have in place for running automated tests are running smoothly and reliably and in a cost-effective manner that works well for the entire team? We also need to make sure that developers get the proper training. So you can't just say, okay, developers, you're responsible for test automation now, go figure it out. There's a lot of skill involved in how to effectively write unit tests, learning about things like mocking and how to appropriately use mocking in order to get unit tests that are actually testing something meaningful. There are different types of test automation. So understanding the differences between unit tests, integration tests, automated acceptance tests, performance tests, exploratory testing, hallway testing, mutation testing, you name it. There are a lot of different types of testing. And developers aren't coming out of school knowing all of these things. So one of the important roles of testers in 2023 is helping developers understand the different types of testing and also helping them understand what types of testing they should own, like unit testing, and what types of testing maybe make sense to have other people own. Maybe things like performance and load testing can be things that make sense to have people who specialize in, depending on the size of your team. In addition to the training, developers also need better support when it comes to testing and test automation. So there's a lot involved in getting tests to be running reliably and fast and green and in a cost-effective way. And that requires a lot of tools, and those tools have to come together in a good, clean way in order to run the tests quickly and reliably. So in addition to learning about the tools, it's helpful to have people who can support the development teams in those efforts. If the system for testing goes down, that halts your software development pipeline. That means you can't deliver features to production. And so you need to be willing and able to support and maintain all of those systems that sit in between the code commit and getting that code shipped to production. And finally, we have to remember that people matter. It's so easy to think in software development, oh, this is the ideal team situation, or we should have this kind of team, that kind of team. But who is actually on your team and who you've hired and who knows a lot about your business and how it works actually matters. So you may need to make a decision that is maybe suboptimal from what a textbook says should be the best way to organize teams, because you have somebody on your team who's been there long enough that they know the ins and outs of every single feature and requirement. And so maybe you want them in the meeting with the product team when they're defining, what should the acceptance criteria be for this story. And so you can't make these decisions just in a vacuum. You really have to consider who is on your team and what kind of things they know. You don't want to brashly just dismiss the amount of knowledge and skills and ability to learn that the people on your team have. And honestly, I think it's unethical and disrespectful to do so when those people have helped you get where you are as a company. And so we really owe it to everybody on the team to help them get into the best role for them and to help coach and train them and give them an opportunity to stretch themselves and grow and really see what we can do as a whole team to work together in a really good way to ship high quality software. So I think the bottom line is in 2023, we don't need dedicated testers any more or any less than we need dedicated software developers. More and more, the two roles are becoming more and more closely aligned. You need to know how to write clean code. You need to know object-oriented design principles. You need to know how to ship and maintain software, keep it clean, keep it working, write automated tests, write code. But I think the people who need to do that need to also be well balanced between, are they that personality that's really great for software development? Or are they that personality that's really great for testing? And I think you need a healthy mix of both of those types of people on your team. So regardless of what we call the job title, I think the teams of the future and the teams that we need to be building this year are going to be cross-functional teams where you have a healthy mix of those different types of people. And you have people on your team who are specialists not only in development versus QA, but you need to have people who have more specialized knowledge in UI development versus API development, or people who have more specialized knowledge in API development versus UI development. And if you get that healthy mix across the board of specialization versus generalization, it's going to be a recipe for success for efficiently and quickly building high quality code. And as with every bit of advice, not only do you have to consider the people involved, you also have to consider your organization. What constraints are you working with in terms of how your company is organized and what you do or do not have the ability to control within your organization? Larger companies, a lot of times they're just kind of stuck with what they have in a lot of different areas. And so you have to decide as a lead SDET or as a director of QA or a VP of engineering, you have to decide what battles do you want to take on and do you want to take them on now or not. But for most organizations, establishing cross-functional teams of people who have a healthy mix between specialized knowledge in UI, API, test automation, DevOps, and bringing these people together on the same team is a recipe for success. So I hope this information has been helpful for you. As a reminder, at Testery, we focus on helping teams with test orchestration. That means we help you help your organization get faster, greener, more cost effective test runs. If you're interested in learning more about how this is possible, reach out to us. We'll be happy to let you know and give you more information.